Well, that's right. This dates back to 2018. A bill that was passed in the Scottish Parliament, and that led to the challenge for Women Scotland, who were the basis of it was a fairly niche piece of legislation. It was about public sector representation on boards that was trying to get equality of membership of boards, and it was challenged because transgender women were included in those quotas. Now, the reason for that being that the Scottish Government took the view that if you were a transgender person who had a gender recognition certificate, then, as that particular law, the Gender Recognition Act, says, you are, for all purposes, a woman. Now, of course, that was challenged by For Women Scotland, who you saw there that they had their appeal upheld. It was unanimously upheld by the panel of 5 judges there. They said that, as set out in the Equality Act in 2010, that the definition of a woman and sex refers to a biological woman. Now, the concerns that For Women Scotland had about this was about single-sex spaces, that if somebody with a gender recognition certificate was protected as a woman under the Equality Act, then what would the implication be for things like single-sex spaces, so prisons, so hospital wards, refuge shelters, support groups for women who have been abused? Their view was that if a trans woman could enter those spaces, then that was not what they wanted. Of course, what we heard there from Lord Hodge was very much that this is not to be viewed as a triumph for Women Scotland. It is to be viewed as, that would be an incorrect interpretation of what the judges have decided. What they have decided is on the letter of the law. They do not make policy. Of course, they are judges. They are not politicians. And what they are saying, of course, is that they say that this should not cause disadvantage to trans people. Trans people also have protected rights under the Equality Act. So a very long judgment and a very complex judgment that's going to take us a while, I think, to understand all of the implications from it. But certainly what the ruling is that the definition of a woman and sex as set out in the Equality Act 2010 refers to a biological woman.
Yes, what fell from this is that they were examining the central question, Lord Hodge said, of whether the provisions of the Equality Act of 2010 are inconsistent with the Gender Recognition Act, and their conclusion is yes, they are. And as you say, Catriona, he went through in some detail 9 different points to back up that position, but suggesting that if you interpret sex based on what you're certificated as, that would weaken the protection of biological sex, and therefore, as you've referred to, would prevent the provision of single-sex spaces that women claim they need to be safe. So it's because there was this sort of difference of interpretation between different pieces of legislation passed at different times. Just to say that we are looking at campaigners there who are clearly pleased with this ruling by the Supreme Court. But Catriona, it fell from the fact that there were different pieces of law that people could interpret in different ways.
Well, that's it, and that's what we've seen played out in the courts over a very long period of time. Of course, this dates back to a bill that was passed in Holyrood in 2018. Now, it was appealed at the outer house of the Court of Session and the inner house of the Court of Session. Of course, it's been back and forth in the courts, and now it has ended up in the highest civil court in the UK, the Supreme Court. This is a big deal, and it is a landmark judgment. There is no doubt about that. And you can see there on the pictures the people that are celebrating the outcome. But of course, Lord Hodge said that this isn't a triumph. This is about how we interpret the law. And he was very clear that judges are not policymakers. That is for politicians to debate. And this will be leading to a huge political debate. This has been something that has been so contentious here in Scotland. Of course, the Scottish Government had the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. Now, it passed at Holyrood, but has been blocked by the UK Government because they said that that it was beyond the premise of the Scottish Parliament's powers to define how people could identify. So this is a contentious issue that it's deeply divided people. This is people's identities that we're talking about, and that is why it has been so passionate on both sides of the debate. But it's a long, ongoing discussion that has been happening for some time now, and this is the culmination of that today, the unanimous decision that in the Equality Act, when a woman is referred to, that means a biological woman. So it does sort out, I think, the conflicts that you were talking about there, Martine, about the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, where it's quite clear that if you have a gender recognition certificate, then for the purposes of the law, you are a woman. But the Equality Act 2010 is not so clear on that. And I think there has been quite a call for people to re-look at the legislation, to see what they can do to tighten it up, to make it clearer. Because, of course, we're in a very different, changing world, and the law was drawn up in 2010, the Equality Act, and it really, the fact is, you've got good, clever lawyers that are able to argue whichever side that they wanted to, and you can see the confusion it's caused. Judges, very, very important people when it comes to making decisions, that it did find itself backing and forthing with one victory for the Scottish Government, a victory for women, then, as they might see it, in the appeal court. So this is the highest civil appeal court in the UK, and they have taken that decision that this refers, that in using the Equality Act of 2010, this is all very complicated, that it refers to a biological woman, how you are born at birth. And for Women in Scotland, who you can see there on the steps of the Supreme Court, there's Joanna Cherry, who used to be an MP, one of the leading campaigners in For Women in Scotland. They have argued throughout this case that sex is biological and it is an immutable fact, and that is what the judges have agreed with.
As you say, members of the various women's groups who have formed part of this appeal backed up the For Women in Scotland group. A few moments ago we were seeing Maya Forstatter and Helen Joyce, who lead the Sex Matters group. They were out there having their photographs taken as well. Clearly a great deal of celebration by these groups, but Lord Hodge said at the very outset, Catriona, that he recognised that there was a huge strength of feeling on both sides, and that there are people who are part of the transgender community who often feel very vulnerable, and they were mindful of that. And very quickly he sought to explain how transgender people would be protected by other means.
That's right. They are protected by gender assignment in the Equality Act 2010. He said that does not change, and that people who are transgender are still protected in the law. They still, of course, can take discrimination claims. This was something I think that there has been so much passion about, because you are talking about a vulnerable community that were concerned that, should what happened today happen, that their rights would be weakened. However, Lord Hodge was absolutely clear right at the outset that under their interpretation of the law, and I say this again, they are not politicians, they are judges, they are interpreting the letter of the law, that they say that trans people still have rights under the equality law, and this, I guess, provides some sort of clarification going forward.
Yes, the fact that the laws that exist are to do with direct and indirect discrimination and harassment, because somebody might suffer those detriments because they are perceived to be a woman or associated with women. But of course there will be concern, Catriona, that those provisions aren't enough.
Well, of course, and that is the debate that has been going on throughout. This is a debate that has been going on for 6-7 years, when people have been looking at this. And, what does it mean? And this is where we've got now, is that at least the judges have provided some clarity on how the Equality Act should be interpreted. Now, we have heard from trans groups throughout the debate in court about how they do feel vulnerable and how rights that they have fought for could be undermined, could be perceived to be undermined. But I think that the judges there were very, very clear that that would not be the case, that in a court of law you are protected as a trans woman or as a trans man. You are protected under the law for that. So I think what the judges have tried to do here is to just shed some light and make things clear so that a debate like this doesn't need to be played out in the courts in the way that it has been over the last 6 years.
Yes, not again, anyway. But I mean, there may be difficulties in interpreting some aspects of policy, as you say, Catriona, because then you might be clear about what the law says, but then how do you apply it in the real world? Well,
the real world is it's difficult to understand how to apply this at the moment. I think public bodies have had a lot of criticism on how they've been dealing with it, have wondered how they should apply the policies. We've heard from the police, we've heard from various other groups about how do you interpret the law to be fair to everybody. I think there's been, of course, here an employment tribunal played out in NHS Fife, where a transgender woman doctor was using a space which a nurse believed to be women only, and that has been something that has played out in the tribunal. And of course there are heated views on both sides. These are both groups that are wanting to protect their identities, and that is why there have been such deep divisions and why you are seeing those scenes outside the Supreme Court today. It's quite a big deal for a women's group to take on a government, and certainly the way it's been interpreted here, that they have won their appeal.
Yes, and they've had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get that done. I mean, just reading on our live page of the BBC website, which is covering this story, and one of our correspondents who is inside the courtroom said that there was an audible intake of breath as Lord Hodge announced that the Equality Act's definition of a woman is based on biological sex. There were pats on the back from fellow campaigners for the representatives for Women Scotland and the group's director Marion Calder wiping away a tear. And just to repeat, the group's appeal to the highest court in the land has been successful, and they have won their case against the Scottish Government. But if we look at the other side of this, Catriona, as well, as we've said, transgender people needed, I suppose, to hear that reassurance from Lord Hodge that this doesn't mean that they're abandoned by the law, that those protections still exist, but from a different quarter.
Well, that's right. Lord Hodge has said, and I can quote this for you, "As I shall explain later in this hand-down speech, the Equality Act 2010 gives transgender people protection, not only against discrimination through the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, but also against direct discrimination, indirect discrimination and harassment in substance in their acquired gender." So again, the judge is making that point very clear, that this is not a triumph for anyone. This is how the words are interpreted. Now, throughout the court case for Women Scotland, they made the argument through their KC, Aidan O'Neill, that men and women, the language there should just be, as it is, simply understood, that it was an immutable biological fact. And of course the other side, the Scottish Government, saying if you have a gender recognition certificate, then you are, in the eyes of the law, under that other law, the Gender Recognition Act, that you are to be treated as a woman. So this is where all of that confusion has come from, and what this does today is provide clarity. But the judge is very, very at pains to say that transgender people will have their rights and they are not being undermined in any way. This is about definition, it's about how you read the law. I did a law degree, and it's a very difficult thing to do, to learn how you read in, how you read up, how you read down. That is the law. It's about interpretation, and that is this is what this is. This has provided clarity. What the UK Supreme Court has done is say, right, we can tell you what this means, which means going forward, this sort of debate shouldn't have to happen. But where does it go, of course, with the politics? And that's the next question of how do public bodies deal with this? How do they deal with tribunals? How do they deal with the questions that are being raised? There's a number of tribunals. There's one here in Scotland pending, looking at single-sex spaces. Should trans people be sharing them with biological women? This is the debate.
Catriona, let's listen into what some of the activists are saying.
This has been a really, really long road. We first took the Scottish Government to court over the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act in 2020, and I have to pay in huge tribute to my co-directors, Marion here, but especially Trina, who's up in Edinburgh, because she was the one who insisted that this was our way to clarify the law, and she kept pushing us and we kept fighting. And who would have thought that, 7 years ago, Marion set up for Women Scotland with Trina and Magdalene, who we wish could have been here to see this today. She would have been so delighted. And we were in a really difficult place in Scotland then. We thought we were going to see rights for women rolled back, and today the judges have said what we always believed to be the case, that women are protected by their biological sex, that sex is real, and that women can now feel safe that services and spaces designated for women are for women, and we are enormously grateful to the Supreme Court for this ruling.
We'd also like to thank our legal team.
Yeah, of course.
Cindy Mules from Balfour and Manson, and our Casey, who's not with us today. But predominantly, we would actually like to thank the women across the whole of the UK and the wider world that has been with us from day one,
yes.
Who believed in us, who contributed £5 per month, who bought our badges, who donated when they didn't have any money to donate. And times are actually tough at the moment, but they actually understood how important our case was and how the protections for women's rights, which we thought we had maybe protected years ago. It just shows you that we have to be ever vigilant on any policies or any legal things that come through to ensure there is no detriment to women's rights. So thank you all for attending here, and thank you all for the women and men that have supported us today.
Susan, can I ask you, what would you say to politicians now? Is there anything they need to do in response to this judgment? What are the implications for politics?
Well, in Scotland specifically, I think what our politicians need to get their heads around is this is the law, and they need to stop pushing faulty guidance into schools and hospitals. And there is going to be, I think there is going to be an ongoing fight, because we still have policies that now we know, we always knew that they were unlawful because they allowed self-ID, and we from our previous rulings we knew self-ID was not lawful. But now we have a really concrete basis on which to go forward, and so we are going to be working on making sure they get those policies out of these places, and hopefully they will start taking our advice a bit more.
What about Westminster?
Well, I suppose for Westminster, I think actually generally politicians there and in Scotland will be breathing a bit of the sigh of relief, because if we'd have lost, they would have had to sort this out, because as the judges said, that interpretation that the EHRC brought forward and the Scottish ministers would have made a mockery of the law. So they would have had a lot of work to do. I bet they're very glad we've saved them that.
Do you have a message for the community who so wished it went the other way today?
I think the thing is we have always said that everybody is protected by the Equality Act, and everybody should be protected by the Equality Act. This is not about prejudice or bigotry, as some people would say. It's not about hatred for another community. It's just about saying that there are differences, and biology is one of those differences, and we just need protections based on that. And I think that we are more than happy for safe services and spaces to be provided for other groups of people depending on their needs. But we have to recognise that different people need different things.
There we have a very happy group of campaigners from for Women Scotland. We were hearing from Susan Smith and then Marion Calder, who are two of the co-directors alongside Trina Budge, who's not there today, celebrating, which the judge, Lord Hodge, said, you know, this is not a triumph of one group over another, but clearly this group of women and others who are supporting them will feel like this is a victory.